December 12, 1939. The forest in Finland was silent, covered in thick snow, and frozen by a merciless -40 degrees Celsius cold. Every branch hung heavy with frost, every footprint was quickly buried by the wind. In the middle of this frozen wilderness, a small Soviet patrol of 15 men moved carefully, unaware that the forest itself was about to become their grave. Their thick wool coats were stiff and uncomfortable, their breath turned to ice on their scarves. They were soldiers of the largest army on earth, the Red Army of Joseph Stalin, confident, loud, and thinking this war would be over in days. They were wrong. In a small village not far from the front, Simo Häyhä, a 33-year-old farmer, quietly prepared for the day. To the world, he was just a simple man, short in height, unassuming, and known for his skill at hunting and marksmanship in his local community. But on this winter morning, Simo was about to become something far more dangerous than anyone could imagine. Armed with his old Finnish M/28-30 rifle, simple iron sights, and a calm mind, he would face an entire army and survive. The Soviet patrol moved confidently along a narrow forest path. Their boots crunched the snow beneath them, their voices carried loudly in the freezing air. Each soldier believed victory was inevitable. They had numbers, tanks, and air support. Finland, a nation of farmers and hunters, could never stand against them, or so they thought. The first shot was almost silent, a whisper lost in the wind. A soldier at the back of the patrol simply dropped, his body collapsing into the snow. There was no cry, no warning. The lieutenant at the front spun around, confused but saw nothing. Then came the second shot. The radio operator, 200 meters ahead, crumpled to the ground. Panic began to ripple through the patrol. Snow had become a deadly trap, and they had no idea from where the invisible threat came. Shots continued in rapid succession. A soldier trying to set up a machine gun fell over it. A sergeant pointing the way was gone in an instant. Within minutes, 12 men of the 15 were dead. The remaining 3 survived only by lying face down in the snow, trembling, praying the unseen enemy would not find them. When they eventually crawled back to their lines, their report made no sense. There was no muzzle flash, no team of snipers, nothing to explain the carnage. They had been hunted by a ghost, a shadow in the white forest. And that ghost was Simo Häyhä. Not a ghost in the supernatural sense, but a man so quiet, so ordinary-looking, that the Red Army never suspected he could be the deadliest threat in the region. Standing barely 5 feet 3, Simo was a farmer who had declared a one-man war against an entire empire. His weapons were simple, his modifications clever but subtle. To the Soviets, the forest had eyes, but those eyes were invisible. The stakes could not have been higher. Finland, with its small, poorly equipped army, faced the might of over 1 million Soviet soldiers. Tanks, artillery, and aircraft filled the enemy's arsenal. Stalin believed the war would last only 10 days. His soldiers laughed and sang, certain that victory was already theirs. But the cold, the snow, the forests, and the Finnish people were not so easily defeated. The Soviets had underestimated the harsh winter and the resilience of those defending their homeland. For Simo, the winter was both enemy and ally. He understood the land like few others. He knew how to move silently on skis, how to camouflage himself in the white snow, and how to endure the freezing temperatures that would cripple ordinary men. Each breath he took, carefully controlled, blended with the air. Every shot he fired was calculated, precise. The rifle's iron sights, simple and reliable, gave no glint in the sunlight. He became part of the snow, part of the silence, an invisible predator among the trees. As the day progressed, the Red Army continued to probe the forests, unaware that a single man was already shaping their fate. Simo's first kills were only the beginning. The soldiers who survived the initial ambush spread fear through the ranks, tales of a phantom sniper in white spreading from one unit to another. Morale, so critical to an army, began to crack. The mighty Red Army, confident in their power, was now facing an enemy they could neither see nor understand. By the end of the first day, it was clear that Finland was not an easy target. One man, a farmer, had proven that skill, patience, and knowledge of the land could outweigh numbers, technology, and brute force. Simo Häyhä had turned the frozen forest into a lethal battlefield, where the rules of war were rewritten by the cunning of a single human mind. The Red Army would soon realize that their enemies were not just soldiers, but ghosts, hunters in white hiding in the endless snow. And at the heart of this nightmare was Simo Häyhä, a quiet man who had chosen to fight with the logic of a farmer, the precision of a marksman, and the relentless determination of someone who would not let his homeland fall. The first day was only the beginning. The story of the White Death, the ghost of the Finnish forest, was about to unfold, and the Red Army would learn that their confidence was their greatest weakness. The snow-covered forests of Finland stretched endlessly, a frozen labyrinth that seemed to go on forever. The Red Army, confident in its numbers and power, continued to advance. They had tanks, artillery, and aircraft. They had trained soldiers, doctrine, and supplies. On paper they were unstoppable. But the Finns, led by their brilliant commander, Marshal Carl Gustav Emil Mannerheim, had a secret weapon: the land itself and the indomitable spirit of their people. Finland had fewer than 300,000 men to face over 1 million Soviet soldiers. Their tanks could not match the thousands of Soviet armored vehicles, and their air force was tiny compared to the Soviet Air Force. The odds were beyond desperate. Yet the Finns did not despair. They had something else: knowledge of the forests, of the cold, and of unconventional warfare. The Finnish soldiers had a word for their national spirit: sisu. It was stubborn courage, perseverance, and unyielding determination. It was what made a small nation stand against a giant. And it was what Simo Häyhä, the quiet farmer, carried within him. The Finns could not fight a conventional war. They could not meet the Red Army on open plains, tank for tank, man for man. It would have been suicide. Instead, they chose a different path. They would let the enemy come to them. They would channel Soviet columns onto frozen lakes, only to shatter the ice with artillery. They would lure them down narrow forest roads, then cut them off. Finnish ski troops, dressed in white, moved silently like ghosts through the trees, striking where the enemy least expected. This strategy became known as Madi tactics, dividing the enemy into smaller, manageable pockets and destroying them one by one. The winter itself became an ally. At -40°C, engines froze, tank grease hardened, and soldiers in inadequate uniforms stood out like black dots against the white snow. Thousands of Soviet soldiers froze to death, often in their tracks, rifles frozen in their hands. The cold was as deadly as any bullet. Amid this frozen battlefield, Simo Häyhä prepared for his daily hunt. A farmer by trade, a marksman by skill, he had transformed himself into a predator. While the Red Army focused on numbers, Simo focused on precision, patience, and adaptation. Every step he took, every breath he drew, was measured and silent. He understood the dangers of the cold better than most officers in the army. Simo's rifle, the M/28-30, was a simple, reliable weapon. Unlike other snipers, he refused a scope. To him, the scope was a liability. It could glint in the sun, giving away his position. It could fog up in the freezing temperatures, ruining a critical shot. And it forced him to lift his head slightly higher, increasing the chance of detection. He trusted iron sights, honed over years of hunting, and his skills were unmatched. The Red Army advanced blindly, their confidence slowly turning into confusion. Stories began to spread among the soldiers, of invisible snipers, of shots that came from nowhere, of men vanishing without a sound. Fear crept into their ranks. Officers became cautious, patrols hesitated, and morale began to falter. Simo had not yet faced them in full force, yet the mere thought of the ghost in the snow terrified them. The Finns used the forest to their advantage. Ambushes were carefully planned, exploiting narrow roads and frozen lakes. Machine guns were set up in hidden positions. Artillery rained down on concentrated Soviet units. The Red Army's massive columns were systematically cut apart, divided, and destroyed. Every victory, no matter how small, sent waves of panic through the enemy lines. And through it all, Simo Häyhä moved silently, a shadow in the white expanse, waiting for the perfect moment to strike. Simo's first major hunts were as much about psychology as about killing. Every shot he fired, every Soviet soldier he eliminated, spread fear. The survivors told stories of a phantom sniper who could not be seen, who could not be found. The Red Army had never encountered anything like this. No amount of training or discipline prepared them for an enemy who could vanish into the snow, appear from nowhere, and disappear again. While Soviet generals in Moscow planned massive offensives and assumed the Finns would collapse quickly, reality was different. Finland's small army, guided by clever strategy and fierce determination, was inflicting heavy casualties. The Red Army's doctrine of overwhelming force failed in the forests. Tanks were useless in narrow paths. Infantry became trapped in snowdrifts. Aircraft could not operate in the constant blizzards. The mightiest army on earth was stuck in a frozen nightmare, facing not just soldiers but an entire landscape designed for resistance. And at the heart of this resistance was Simo Häyhä. He did not see himself as a hero. He was a farmer defending his home. But his skill and understanding of the environment made him the deadliest weapon the Finns had. Every day he emerged from his home, armed with nothing more than his rifle, iron sights, and cunning, ready to become the White Death, the ghost that would haunt Soviet soldiers for the rest of the war. The Red Army's confidence was slipping. Each failed patrol, each ambushed column made them more cautious. Fear replaced arrogance. What they had assumed would be an easy victory became a test of survival. One man, a small farmer, was proving that knowledge, skill, and courage could overcome even the greatest power on earth. By the end of Part 2, the audience sees that Finland is fighting an impossible war, but with strategy, courage, and the cunning of a few individuals like Simo Häyhä, even the mightiest army can be brought to its knees. The stage is set for Simo's rise as the ghost of the forest, the White Death. The Finnish winter was relentless. Snow stretched for miles in every direction, covering the forests and fields in a thick, unbroken blanket of white. To an ordinary soldier, this frozen landscape was cruel, merciless, and deadly. But to Simo Häyhä, it was home, a familiar terrain where he could move unseen, strike swiftly, and vanish without a trace. The Red Army had no idea that the deadliest sniper in human history was about to emerge, a farmer who would turn the cold itself into a weapon. Simo was small, barely 5'3", and unassuming. He blended perfectly into the snow with his thick white camouflage, his skis allowing him to glide silently over frozen lakes and snow-covered paths. Every morning before dawn he would wake, layer himself in clothing and prepare for the hunt. A simple farmer in appearance, he carried the mind of a marksman, a man who understood the science of shooting, the tricks of the cold, and the psychology of fear. One of Simo's first decisions changed the course of his legendary career. While the world's snipers were eager to use high-tech scopes for magnification, Simo refused. The scopes, he knew, were more dangerous than helpful. Even the slightest glint of sunlight off a scope could give away his position to an enemy hundreds of meters away. Scopes fogged in extreme cold, leaving the shooter blind at a critical moment. And the very act of using a scope forced a man to raise his head slightly higher, exposing him to detection. Simo preferred iron sights, simple, reliable, and invisible. His eyes, trained for years on hunting animals in the forests of Finland, were all the magnification he needed. But his genius went beyond refusing a scope. He invented small, simple tricks that transformed him into a ghost. When a sniper fired, the small puff of snow in front of the rifle could reveal his position. Simo's solution was brilliant in its simplicity. He spent hours packing down the snow in front of his chosen spot and pouring water over it, letting it freeze into a solid block of ice. When he fired, the ice absorbed the recoil and the small cloud of snow vanished. There was no signal, no movement, no warning. Breath was another danger. At -40°C, each exhale produced a cloud of vapor, signaling exactly where the shooter was lying. Simo's solution was astonishingly simple. He kept a mouthful of snow. The cold snow cooled his breath inside his body, making it invisible to the enemy. Even a trained sniper scanning the horizon could see nothing. There was no fog, no steam, no hint of a human presence. With his camouflage, iron sights, and frozen muzzle, Simo became the perfect predator. He did not move without purpose. He did not fire without certainty. Each shot was deliberate, measured, and devastating. He studied the patterns of Soviet patrols, noting where they stopped, where they ate, and where they relaxed. Every moment of carelessness became an opportunity. Officers reading maps, machine gun teams setting up, soldiers running between positions. All were within his deadly reach. Simo's routine was brutal and disciplined. Each morning he would pack bread and sugar, strap on skis, and ski alone into enemy territory. Hours would pass as he waited in silence, hidden in the snow, breathing carefully, observing the enemy. Patience was his ally, cold his companion, and snow his shield. He became part of the forest, part of the silence. The Red Army had no idea that the ground itself could hide a hunter, or that the sound of a rifle shot could vanish without a trace. The first kills were terrifying for the Soviets. A machine gunner fell before he could fire. A sergeant collapsed while pointing a direction. Within minutes, Simo decimated patrols that should have had no fear. Survivors were frozen in the snow, praying for survival, while tales of a ghost spread among the soldiers. Some claimed it was supernatural, others believed they were being cursed. In reality, it was pure skill, patience, and cunning. Simo's attacks were not just about killing, they were psychological warfare. Soldiers learned to fear the silence, the forest, and their own shadows. No one felt safe. Patrols hesitated. Officers worried. The Red Army, confident in their overwhelming numbers, now faced terror and uncertainty. Every failed mission, every ambushed patrol, was proof that this was no ordinary sniper. This was a man who had adapted to the cold, mastered the land, and understood the enemy better than they understood themselves. By the end of his first weeks on the front, Simo Häyhä was no longer just a soldier. He was a legend in the making. The Finnish soldiers began to call him the White Death, a name that would spread through Soviet lines and strike fear into every soldier who dared enter the forests. He had taken the tools of a simple farmer, a rifle, knowledge of the land, and patience, and used them to rewrite the rules of war. The Red Army had seen nothing like it. Their best snipers, trained for years with advanced rifles, could not find him. Every attempt to track him ended in failure. Simo was a ghost. Invisible, silent, unstoppable. He did not just kill, he paralyzed the enemy with fear. An army that believed itself invincible was being outsmarted by a single man in white, armed with nothing but iron sights and snow. In those frozen days, Simo Häyhä became the embodiment of Finland's resistance. Patient, cunning, and relentless. The Red Army's numbers and technology counted for nothing. Every step they took in the snow could be their last. And at the heart of this terror was the quiet farmer, a man who had become the deadliest sniper in history, not through brute force, but through intelligence, discipline, and an unyielding understanding of the land and the cold. The forest whispered with his presence, the snow hid his tracks, and the enemy learned to fear every silent shadow. Simo Häyhä, the White Death, had been born, and the world would never forget him. The frozen forests of Finland had become a deadly stage for a war unlike any other. The Red Army, confident in its overwhelming numbers, marched blindly into a trap they could not see. Their tanks ground slowly over frozen roads, artillery roared across the landscape, and thousands of soldiers trudged through snow that reached above their knees. But amidst all this chaos, one man moved silently, unseen, and struck with terrifying precision. Simo Häyhä, the White Death, had transformed from a quiet farmer into a living nightmare for the invaders. Every morning, Simo woke before dawn. He dressed in layers of white, blending perfectly with the snow-covered forest. His rifle, the trusted M/28-30, rested in his hands. He carried nothing that could betray him. His movements were deliberate, careful, practiced. He would ski silently over frozen lakes and snow-packed roads, moving toward positions he had prepared the day before. Snow underfoot made no sound. Wind carried no signal. He became a shadow, a ghost, invisible even to trained eyes. When he reached his position, he would prepare meticulously. Snow was packed tightly in front of his rifle and frozen into a block of ice, absorbing the recoil of the shot and hiding any telltale movement. A mouthful of snow cooled his breath, keeping it invisible in the freezing air. He adjusted his position so his head remained low, and his iron sights, simple and reliable, offered no glint to alert the enemy. Every detail mattered. The slightest mistake could mean death or failure. Simo's first targets were officers and machine gun teams, the soldiers who would have commanded or threatened the Finnish lines. He observed the Soviets carefully, noting their routines. Officers would pause to read maps, soldiers would gather to set up heavy weapons, others would run between positions. Patience was key. Hours could pass before a single shot. But when he fired, it was precise, lethal, and devastating. The first patrol he encountered that morning moved confidently through the forest, unaware that death waited for them. One by one, Simo picked them off. A man setting up a machine gun froze, then fell. A sergeant pointing directions collapsed backward. A soldier running to warn his comrades never reached them. Within minutes, 12 men were dead. The remaining 3 crawled to safety, terrified, unable to comprehend what had happened. They spoke later of a ghost, of a sniper who had vanished without a trace. They could not see him, but they had felt him, and that terror spread through the ranks. The impact was not just physical, it was psychological. Fear began to take hold of the Red Army. Soldiers hesitated, patrols slowed, and commanders worried. The once confident invaders began to doubt themselves. Every sound in the forest, every shadow in the snow, could be Simo Häyhä. The forest itself became an ally to the Finns, concealing the White Death while amplifying the fear he inspired. Simo's approach was methodical. He never fired twice from the same position. After a few kills, he would ski silently to a new location, using his knowledge of the terrain to stay ahead of any potential counter-snipers. Artillery barrages by the Soviets often destroyed only trees, leaving him untouched. By the time they realized he had moved, he had already prepared his next deadly position. The Red Army, with all its training in numbers, was being outsmarted by a single man who understood snow, cold, and human behavior better than they did. Even the elite Soviet snipers could not catch him. They were sent in with scoped rifles and advanced training, yet Simo hunted them. From 400 meters away he would wait patiently, watching them move. One by one they fell, each shot precise, each death a demonstration of his skill. The Soviets began to whisper about him in terror. He was no longer just a man, he was the forest itself, the winter itself, a predator who could not be tracked or stopped. As weeks passed, his kills mounted. 25 men one day, 38 another, and by the end of the first month the numbers were staggering. The Soviets had underestimated the Finns, but more importantly, they had underestimated the ingenuity of a single, determined man. Simo's modifications to his rifle, his clever use of snow and ice, and his ability to move silently made him the deadliest sniper of the Winter War. Every shot he fired was a lesson in terror. The Red Army learned quickly that nothing in their training prepared them for this. They avoided fires, moved cautiously, and hesitated to patrol. Every soldier knew the stories. The White Death was watching. If a man strayed too far, if a head was raised too high, if a rifle glinted in the snow, even slightly, it could be the last mistake he ever made. Simo had weaponized the forest, the snow, and the cold against them. The psychological toll on the enemy was immense. Soldiers froze not only from the cold but from fear. Officers refused to leave bunkers. Patrols stopped moving. The Red Army had come expecting victory, but instead they found themselves paralyzed, hunted, and humiliated by a single man. And Simo Häyhä? He continued his daily routine, calm, disciplined, focused, a farmer by nature but a ghost of death by necessity. By the end of Part 4, it was clear that Simo Häyhä was more than a sniper. He was a symbol of Finnish resistance, a living weapon, and a psychological force that terrified the Red Army far more than numbers or artillery could. The legend of the White Death was growing, and every patrol, every failed attack, spread his name through the enemy ranks. Finland, outnumbered and outgunned, had found its deadliest protector. The legend of the White Death had reached Moscow. Reports of a single Finnish sniper decimating entire patrols, vanishing without a trace, and striking fear into the hearts of trained soldiers alarmed the Soviet High Command. The Red Army, confident and proud, had never imagined being outsmarted by a single man. Now their arrogance had turned to desperation. Orders came down: find the White Death. Kill him at any cost. Simo Häyhä, the quiet farmer from Ryhjärvi, remained unaware of the scale of the hunt. To him each day was a continuation of the same disciplined routine. He would wake before dawn, layer himself in white camouflage, and ski silently into enemy territory. His rifle rested in his hands. His snow and ice techniques were perfected. He was invisible. Yet every move he made was now being tracked in enemy mines. The Soviets were learning. They would send their best hunters, snipers trained for years in Moscow, armed with the finest rifles and guided by elite scouts. The first Soviet counter-sniper platoon moved into the forests near the Kola River. 30 of the Red Army's most skilled shooters, each armed with scoped rifles, supported by machine gunners, were tasked with a single mission: eliminate the White Death. They advanced cautiously, moving in tactical formations, scanning every tree, every mound of snow, every shadow. Their confidence, once unshakable, now faltered under the weight of fear. Simo had already observed their movements from hundreds of meters away. He did not panic. He did not fire immediately. He let them move past, counting, calculating, waiting. The key to his success was patience. One wrong shot, one early movement could expose him. But he had trained for this. His camouflage was flawless, his iron sights precise, his breath invisible. He was the predator, they were the prey. Hours passed in silence. Then the first shot rang out, soft, precise, invisible. A radio operator at the rear of the platoon collapsed, a clean, fatal hole in his chest. Panic spread through the Soviet ranks. Officers shouted orders, but the shots kept coming. Another man fell. Then another. Simo was not moving. He was simply waiting in his frozen nest, invisible to their scopes, undetectable in the white expanse. The Soviet soldiers fired blindly, their scopes glinting, their machine guns tearing through the trees. But Simo had already moved. He had pre-prepared his next position, 300 meters to the flank, and waited again. When the next group of soldiers emerged, he picked them off one by one. Officers were paralyzed, machine gunners eliminated, and the soldiers' confidence shattered. Within hours, more than half of the elite platoon was dead or fleeing in terror. The Red Army had unleashed its finest hunters, only to be hunted themselves. Every failed attempt to kill him amplified his legend. The surviving soldiers spread stories of a ghost in the snow, invisible, unstoppable. They could see no tracks, no footprints, no sign of a man. Their training told them to hunt, to advance, to retaliate, but the forest had become a trap. Simo used it to his advantage, moving silently, changing positions, exploiting every flaw in their formation. The psychological impact was immense. Soldiers who had survived previous ambushes refused to leave bunkers. Patrols stopped altogether. Even officers hesitated to move beyond their fortified positions. Fear had become a weapon as deadly as Simo's rifle. The Red Army, a massive force, was paralyzed by a single man's skill and ingenuity. Simo's strategy was not merely about killing, it was about creating terror, confusion, and hesitation. Each patrol he ambushed left survivors who carried tales of the White Death, spreading fear like wildfire across the enemy lines. The Red Army's massive numbers, tanks, and artillery meant nothing if soldiers refused to move, if officers doubted themselves, if morale collapsed. Simo had weaponized fear itself. The hunt escalated. Soviet commanders brought in artillery barrages to destroy suspected sniper positions. Hundreds of shells fired at once, turning forests into black, splintered moonscapes. Trees fell, snow was shredded, the ground churned into frozen mud. But Simo adapted. The explosions masked the sound of his shots. He moved silently through the craters, always ahead of his enemies, using the chaos to hunt again. By late February 1940, the Soviets understood one grim truth. The hunter was more dangerous than any army. Elite sniper teams, machine gunners, and heavy artillery could not stop him. The White Death was everywhere and nowhere, striking from unseen positions, vanishing like smoke in the wind. Every day he claimed more lives, each shot a testament to discipline, cunning, and the cold precision of a man who had become a master of winter warfare. Simo Häyhä had turned the forest into a nightmare for the Red Army. The hunters had become the hunted. The once confident invaders now feared every shadow, every whisper of snow, every silent movement in the trees. A single farmer had changed the balance of power in the frozen forests of Finland. The legend of the White Death was no longer a rumor. It was a terrifying reality, a ghost in the snow that the largest army on earth could not kill. By the end of Part 5 it was clear. Simo Häyhä was not only Finland's deadliest sniper, he was a psychological force, a master strategist, and a ghost whose presence alone could terrify an army. The Soviets were now in full retreat, not just from bullets but from fear itself. By early March 1940, the Kola front had become a battlefield dominated by fear. The Red Army, once confident and unstoppable, was now desperate. Their soldiers spoke in hushed tones of the White Death, the invisible hunter who struck with terrifying accuracy and vanished without a trace. Reports of fallen patrols, shattered units, and elite snipers killed before they could aim reached the highest levels of command. Stalin's generals were humiliated. Something had to be done. The Soviets could not allow a single man to defy their entire army. They assembled their ultimate force, 30 of the Red Army's best snipers, supported by machine gunners and scouts, each handpicked for skill, experience, and ruthlessness. They were sent into the forests near Kola with one mission: kill Simo Häyhä at any cost. These were men trained for years in Moscow's elite sniper schools, armed with the latest rifles and scopes. They believed they were superior in every way, confident they would finally eliminate the Finnish ghost. Simo, however, was undeterred. He had faced hundreds of Soviet soldiers, survived artillery barrages, and perfected his techniques in the harshest winter conditions. He knew the enemy's habits, their psychology, and their weaknesses. Every move of the elite team was anticipated. From his hidden position 400 meters away, he observed them advancing in tight formation, scanning every tree, listening for the slightest sound. His heart remained steady, his breath invisible, his iron sights ready. The first shots were devastating. A radio operator fell silently, a single shot through the chest. Another soldier dropped while moving toward cover. Panic rippled through the platoon. The elite snipers, trained to eliminate targets quickly, realized they were not hunting a man, they were being hunted. Simo had chosen his positions carefully. He did not strike immediately. He waited, calculating, letting the enemy expose themselves. Hours passed with intermittent gunfire. Simo moved silently between pre-prepared nests, always a step ahead of the enemy. One by one, the Soviet snipers fell, their scopes useless against a man who refused magnification, whose iron sights and careful preparation made him invisible. Officers were paralyzed. Machine gunners fired blindly, aiming at shadows and snowdrifts, accomplishing nothing. The hunters had become the hunted. The psychological terror was overwhelming. Soldiers froze at the slightest sound. Every shadow in the trees could be the White Death. They questioned their training, their orders, their very presence in the forest. Simo was no longer just a sniper, he was a force of nature. Invisible, relentless, and patient. He became part of the snow, part of the silence. The forest itself seemed to obey him. But the Soviets were relentless. They changed tactics, bringing in artillery barrages, attempting to obliterate suspected positions. Hundreds of shells rained down on the forests, turning snow-covered trees into splintered, blackened wastelands. The ground became treacherous, filled with craters and debris. Most soldiers would have panicked, frozen by fear and chaos. Not Simo. He used the explosions as cover, moving silently through the shattered landscape, firing from positions that had been prepared days in advance. Each shot was precise, each kill deliberate, each movement calculated. One night, a small group of 6 Soviet soldiers, seeking warmth from the freezing cold, lit a small fire. They ignored protocol, ignoring their training, driven by desperation and exhaustion. Simo watched them from his hidden position. He did not hesitate. With his Swami KP-31 submachine gun, he emerged like a phantom from the trees and emptied a drum of 71 rounds into the group. The firefight was over in 10 seconds. The remaining soldiers fled into the darkness, terrified, leaving their dead behind. Simo had struck fear into the heart of the Red Army once more. By March 6, the 100th day of the war, the Red Army launched a massive final offensive at the Kola sector. Tanks, artillery, and thousands of men pressed forward, attempting to break through the Finnish lines. Simo was in position as usual, his M/28-30 rifle ready, his iron sights precise. The forest was a maze of snow, shattered trees, and craters from the relentless Soviet shelling. Every step the enemy took was dangerous. Every movement could be their last. Amidst the chaos, Simo was struck. A single Soviet soldier, likely a counter-sniper, fired an explosive round from 300 meters away. The bullet hit Simo directly in the left cheek. The impact was catastrophic. His upper and lower jaw shattered. Blood filled his mouth, vision went white, and he fell into the snow, unconscious. The Red Army had finally landed a devastating blow. When Finnish soldiers reached him, they found a nightmare. Half of his face destroyed, broken teeth, and severe wounds. He had been struck down, yet he was alive. Despite the horrifying injury, the man who had become the White Death had survived. He would be taken to a field hospital, where doctors would spend months repairing his face through agonizing surgeries. His body bore the marks of war, but his spirit, his legendary Tsisu, his courage and determination, remained intact. The Soviet offensive continued, but the legend of the White Death had already changed the course of the conflict. The Red Army, humiliated and fearful, had learned that no technology, no training, and no numbers could match the skill, patience, and ingenuity of a single man who mastered the forest, the snow, and the winter itself. Simo Häyhä had not only killed hundreds of soldiers, he had broken their morale, terrified their commanders, and rewritten the rules of sniper warfare forever. By the end of Part 6, it was clear. Simo Häyhä had faced the Soviet elite and survived, a farmer transformed into a legend, a ghost in the snow whose name would haunt armies and inspire generations. The White Death had endured, and the frozen forests of Finland bore silent witness to his incredible skill, resilience, and courage. The war had ended, but for Simo Häyhä the battle was far from over. The Winter War was technically over on March 13, 1940, with the signing of the Moscow Peace Treaty. Finland had lost territory, giving up 11% of its land, but the victory claimed by the Red Army was hollow. The Soviets had been humiliated, suffering enormous losses at the hands of a tiny nation and one extraordinary man. One farmer, barely 5 feet 3 inches tall, had stopped entire units of the largest army on Earth. His tally of confirmed sniper kills, 505 men in less than 100 days, was staggering, and his impact extended far beyond numbers. Yet Simo himself lay in a field hospital, fighting the most personal and grueling battle of his life. The explosive bullet that had struck him on March 6 had torn through his left cheek and jaw, shattering bone and tearing flesh. 4 days, he hovered between life and death, unconscious amid the chaos of field hospitals overwhelmed with wounded soldiers. The doctors were faced with a nearly impossible task: to reconstruct a face almost destroyed beyond recognition. Over the next 14 months, Simo endured 26 excruciating surgeries. Bone was taken from his hip to rebuild his jaw. Skin from his thigh became a new cheek. Every procedure was painful, every recovery slow and uncertain. The man who had faced death thousands of times on the front lines now faced a different kind of agony, one fought with courage and patience rather than a rifle. His spirit, however, remained unbroken. Even as he lay in the hospital, the determination and quiet strength that had made him the White Death never wavered. When he finally emerged from the hospital, Simo was a changed man. The left side of his face remained permanently scarred, a visible testament to the violence he had survived. Yet he carried no anger, no desire for fame, no boast of his extraordinary wartime achievements. He had lived the war as he had lived his life, as a quiet, disciplined man of action, letting results speak louder than words. The Finnish government recognized his incredible contributions. He was promoted from corporal to second lieutenant, the fastest battlefield promotion in Finnish history, and awarded the Cross of Kola for his bravery. Yet he refused the spotlight. He did not write books, give speeches, or travel for parades. Instead, he returned home to the life he had always known. Simo returned to farming, breeding hunting dogs, and hunting moose in the forests of Finland. He applied the same patience, observation, and discipline that had made him the deadliest sniper in history to his work on the land. For 50 years, he lived quietly, a man at peace with nature and his past, yet carrying within him the memory of a winter that had changed the world. His impact, however, extended far beyond Finland's borders. Military historians studied his techniques, noting the brilliance of his modifications, using iron sights to avoid glint, packing snow in front of the rifle to eliminate muzzle blast, holding snow in his mouth to conceal his breath. These simple yet revolutionary ideas changed sniper warfare forever. His patience, his understanding of terrain and environment, and his psychological impact on the enemy became case studies in military academies worldwide. The fear he had instilled in the Red Army had wider consequences. Stalin's generals, humiliated by repeated failures against a single man, learned that sheer numbers alone could not guarantee victory. Adolf Hitler, observing the Red Army's poor performance in Finland, would later be influenced by the perception of Soviet weakness in planning Operation Barbarossa. Simo's quiet, deadly resistance had ripples far beyond his immediate battlefield. In interviews decades later, journalists asked Simo about the secret of his success. He was humble, almost dismissive. "Practice," he said simply. Practice had turned a farmer into a master marksman. Practice had turned knowledge of snow, cold, and patience into a weapon of war. He never sought glory, yet his legacy endured. The White Death became more than a soldier. He became a symbol of courage, resilience, and ingenuity. Simo Häyhä died in 2002 at the age of 96, in Ruokolahti, Finland. He was buried quietly in the land he had protected, a hero without pretense, remembered not just for the lives he took, but for the lives he protected, the nation he defended, and the fear he instilled in those who underestimated him. Today he is remembered as the deadliest sniper in human history, a man whose courage and skill shaped not only a war but the course of history itself. The story of Simo Häyhä reminds us that wars are not always won by numbers, technology, or strategy alone. Sometimes they are won by individuals, quiet, unassuming yet extraordinary, who understand their environment, master their craft, and act with courage and determination. One farmer, a ghost in the snow, changed the course of history. One man, armed with patience, skill, and the winter itself, became a legend.